we can spend our time, but we can't duplicate our time. We can't get it back. So, what are you going to do with the resources and the energy and the money and the time that you have? Because it is finite, and it's a great opportunity, actually.
Hello and welcome to Speak Life. My name is Glenn. We're in a series called The Way Back. Is there a way back to Christian faith in our post-Christian West? We think so, and so does our guest, Cathy Madavan. She is the author of many books, including Why Less Means More, and she joins me on the line from Bristol with her book there. Can you show us your book, Cathy?
Oh, there it is. Isn't she pretty? Why Less Means More. It's so nice to be with you.
It's so nice to be with you. I love the minimalistic cover. Yes, it couldn't be busy, could it? You couldn't have a busy cover with a title like that.
This is a chilled out book cover.
It started out really cluttered, and then you thought, no, we need less.
It actually did. That is what happened.
Is that right? And then you got the graphic artist to read the book. I've already prompted you that the next few minutes are going to be a counselling session where you're going to be partly a pastoral counsellor and partly my confessor as I come to you and unburden myself of the modern malaise that afflicts me and that afflicts so many people. I don't think that less is more, Cathy. I think more is more. I always want more. I want it all the time, and I want it now. What's wrong with me?
Well, I think, okay, so I've somehow got to be your counsellor. That's deeply concerning, because I think in reality, I probably feel exactly the same as you. I think, I remember somebody once saying, I think it was David Kinnaman, once said that consumerism is like the amniotic fluid in which we live and breathe. It's like we are so in it, and we're constantly told, aren't we, that we need more success, more money, more muscles, more foreign holidays, more, whatever the question is, the answer is more. And I think, honestly, even good things, we need to make more ethical choices. We need to be more sustainable. That there's this constant sense of, accumulation of projects, responsibilities, possessions. Richard Foster often talked about the undisciplined pursuit of more. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the culture that we live in. That's the worldview that we're consumed by. And quite honestly, I think we're probably all a little bit infected.
Yeah, I am definitely affected. And what's interesting is, as you ran through that list of some things that we want more of, like some of them landed with me and some of them didn't. So in terms of stuff, I don't care about stuff. I'm quite unconsumeristic in that sense, but in terms of experiences and in terms of the fear of missing out, I have FOMO to the max, where like before I got into my 40s, I would stay up late into the night because there was always somebody having fun. And there always is somebody having fun. Now that we live in a very online world, there's always something happening somewhere. And I couldn't go to sleep if I had the merest notion that somebody is having fun somewhere. Now that I'm in my 40s, like I'm in bed by 9 o'clock with a cup of cocoa. But FOMO. Help me with FOMO. Why am I this way where I fear missing out so much?
Well, I think, so in the book, Why Less Means More, every chapter has got less something and more something. And it's kind of understanding that there are some things we need less of and there are some things we need more of. And one of those chapters actually just came to mind, and it talks about less extraordinary and more ordinary. And I think we live in a culture that is, obsessed with extraordinary. You can't, propose to a fiance now by getting down on one knee. You have to do it like jumping off a cliff with an orchestra coming out of the bushes, film crew taking 4 angles, on social media 3 minutes later. World Book Day for our kids. They need to be dressed up in full Tudor regalia. Like there's absolutely no compromise, isn't it? And so I think we are surrounded, particularly social media, I think has shaped this, with a sense that everything everywhere is extraordinary, and anything less than extraordinary is just a bit below par. And what that stops us doing is actually living our ordinary life where the significant stuff happens, with real meaning, and understanding that if we notice what's happening around us and we just go at the right pace for us and enjoy the riches of the things that we already have, maybe actually we will feel more fulfilled and not less.
That's it's an attractive proposition, but you've got to get over that first hurdle of you want more ordinary? No, we like you are calling us to finitude, right? To understanding our finiteness, understanding our boundaries, understanding our limits. And I wonder, what is it in modern life that makes us want to transcend those limits, or makes us believe that we can transcend those limits?
I think that's the problem really, is that we're looking at the absolute best of everybody else's life and the capacity that they have and the experiences that they have. And we're looking at our own lives in contrast. But the reality is, Dr. Swenson, I think, was someone who talks about the law of limits and the fact that, we all have physical, emotional, mental, spiritual limits. I know as a person who's 5'1" tall that I can't reach the things on the top shelf at the supermarket. I have physical limits. I can't lift a car. There are things I can't do, but I don't always necessarily understand that I also have a level of bandwidth emotionally, and that mentally there is a point where I have lost my margin. I think margin, I describe margin as the space between us and our limits. And I think so many of us are constantly not just eating into our margin mentally, emotionally, physically, and our time and our diaries, financially, that we're actually breaching our limits and then wondering why we have this outbreak of stress and, mental health issues. Because it's hard work living at the edge of your limits while you're comparing your limits with everybody else's.
Yeah, completely. And I wonder if many people listening into this, as soon as you said you're 5'1", a lot of people thought, oh, is she? She looks exactly the same. She takes up exactly the same size on the screen as Glen does. And one issue is online. There is a great escape from limits, and there is a great escape from our embodiedness, which is a really cool thing in lots of different ways. And I know, for instance, the disability community can have so much more visibility online, and it's a real equalizer in that sense. And transcending limits in that sense has brought huge benefits to society, but there are also costs, I guess you're saying.
I mean, that's exactly right. And actually, I have a husband who's disabled. He's blind, actually. And I know for us, we're really good friends with a lot of people who have different physical limitations. And the online world can be absolutely marvelous. It can also be a huge barrier. It's quite hard doing things on Zoom when you can't see, I have to tell you. So actually, it can be both. But I think the reality is that the online world has opened us up to all kinds of things. And some of those are good and some of those are bad. And I suppose what I'm asking the question is in the complexity of life, the answer isn't just simplicity, because we can't all just go and live on an allotment, knitting our knickers, growing our vegetables, resigning and refunding our children. And it's not always possible. So while some simplicity actually I think is a good thing, I think the answer to complexity is actually clarity. When we have so much at our disposal and our boundaries seem to be endless, when our lives are getting increasingly complex and the emails and life just never ends, what we need is clarity. We need clarity about what's important to us and what to make space for, and where our precious resources of our time and our energy and our efforts are actually being spent. Because, if we don't prioritize our life, someone else will do it for us. That's my experience anyway.
Right. And you say clarity. I guess what is involved in clarity? There's a sense of perspective, a sense of distance from your life and able to make wise choices. How do you get clarity?
I mean, that's a big question right there. And, I think clarity for me, anyway, and this is, and hopefully people will come to their own conclusions about what's clear for them. But I hope to assist people on that journey in the book. It's for me, it's about understanding what your values are, what are the things that are really important to you, and then kind of aligning your life and recalibrating your life around it. Because I think this mindless more mindset, like this accumulation, this being responsive to all the stuff that life throws at us, doesn't necessarily make us more resilient. It just makes us overwhelmed quite often. So I think for me, it's about clarifying, hey, what are the values that are really important to me? What are the relationships that are really important to me? Maybe if you're a person of faith, what is the faith that's really important to you and the values that come with that? And going, well, if I look at my diary, if I look at my bank account, if I look at my priorities, how much of that actually mirrors what I say is really important to me. Sadly, it's often when a diagnosis or a redundancy, or, we've had a couple of years of a lot less where we lost a huge amount, ended up living in someone's spare room for a year, and, definitely just not the change of life we expected. But that was the context in which I was able to write a book about, well, what do I want more of and what do I want less of? Because sometimes it's when we have one of those kind of car crash moments that we really wake up to what we value most.
Yeah. So tell me about some of that. Why is Cathy Madavan the person to be writing this book? What's led you on your journey to this point?
Well, it's certainly not because I'm a really chill Zen person who lives a very, simple. I mean, if you just knew how many pairs of shoes I had, you'd kind of chuck me off this call right now. But I think I wrote it because I sensed that this was an issue I struggled with, and that my life was cluttered. And not just my shoe cupboard, but, my life. My life was cluttered with responsibility and stress and people and needing approval. And I could see that some of the things that I was doing were, I was just on this conveyor belt, on this hamster wheel, and I didn't even know how to get off it anymore. And then a couple of years ago, my husband's a church leader, and we'd been in that place for nearly 20 years, just built a £6 million new building. It was, a huge accomplishment. And then COVID happened. And then when we came out of that, there was just an absolute certainty that our time there had kind of unexpectedly come to a close. And as church leaders, that also means losing our home, losing our community, losing the place where we brought up our children. So we sold our house, not knowing actually where we were going next, which was kind of unexpected. And then, just this whole year of wilderness, I suppose, living in a friend's home and not knowing where we're going next, just with a suitcase of stuff, and really thinking, wow, like there are some things that have remained. In fact, there was a moment where I closed the door on our house and it was tough. It was a really sad day, but I had an overwhelming sense that everything that really mattered to us, like our experience, our memories, our values, our relationships, our families, everything that really mattered was actually coming right with us. We weren't leaving it behind at all. And that really helped me to start thinking for myself, what is that clarity about what I treasure the most? And how much do I really invest in those things?
Right. And when things come to an end, you suddenly recognize the value of them, and that, we are not infinite creatures living in an infinite, on an infinite timeline, which is, again, what we're tempted to think in an online world where you can just download anything for free. I have all the music in the world on this phone. I can literally download all the name any song by any artist at any point, and I can download. And that idea that life is like that it's this sort of infinite smorgasbord. But as you say, it is doled out to us one day at a time, isn't it? As Jesus very famously kind of puts it in Matthew chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount. Take no thought for tomorrow has enough worries of its own. Living day by day is kind of the heart of a wisdom about life, isn't it? It's like narrowing ourselves down to the embodied, neighborly, local kind of life that God has given me in this moment. That's where life is really found, would you say?
Well, I love what you've just said, and I think it's really true. I don't think there's anything wrong with having ambitions and dreams and planning and looking ahead. I love, loving James 5, though, where the brother of Jesus, James, is writing, and he talks about waiting like a farmer. And he said, you make your plans for tomorrow, but you don't know what tomorrow holds. And so although I think it's okay to make plans for tomorrow, and I think it's, okay to, I have to plan to write a book, you have to plan to make a podcast. But I think there is a sense in which if we only feel secure and significant in the world when we are reaching certain metrics and benchmarks for success, which are frankly often unattainable and unsustainable, then we have some issues. And, I think going back to the disability thing, it's really interesting that I think our benchmarks and metrics for success as a society are often hyper productive, hyper cognitive, and hyper effective, and hyper beautiful. And actually, most of us, if we ever hit any of those things for even a nanosecond, it won't be for very long. None of us are always physically strong. None of us are always beautiful or always mentally strong. And actually, who is normal anyway? None of us hit that societal expectation of what normal is. So there is something about understanding that success, less success and more significance is one of the things I talk about, because I think significance is different. I think it's understanding that both in the small, the very local, but also, yes, of course, if you're doing wider things, that can give you success. That success can give you significance too. But our sense of security and esteem, it's very fragile if we start pinning it onto things that the world tell us is successful, because they're not often permanent.
Yes, no, and you're absolutely right that, we cannot be hyper beautiful all the time. Sometimes I dip down from hyper beautiful to only super beautiful, but then I pull it together and get back up to hyper beautiful, which
I'm so glad you made the effort for us today.
This is the effort. You get the blue hoodie for me. So we've mentioned a little bit about Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount. There's something about living day by day, for instance, as some biblical wisdom. We've mentioned James, the brother of Jesus, who famously says, just after the bit that you mentioned, what is your life? You're a mist, which I love.
He was always very subtle, James. I think the book of James is, it's just got punch after punch after punch, right. Loads of wisdom, but definitely delivered fairly directly.
It slaps you around the face with some wisdom. Tell me about some more biblical wisdom that we can apply to this area of life.
Well, for me, it was when I was researching this whole area and living through it, frankly, one of the things that I don't often read, there's a book called Leviticus in the Old Testament. Some people will be aware of it, others might not be. It's not, it's not exactly the book that I turn to all the time. But in the middle of Leviticus, you find this moment where Moses is telling the people of God how to live a good, holy, wise life. And in that is all kinds of great advice about not killing people and, not being adulterous and stuff.
Love your neighbor as yourself. That's the most famous bit of that chapter, isn't it? He says, love your neighbor as yourself.
Exactly. So all kinds of fantastic wisdom in there. But then you come across this interesting and slightly obscure instruction to the people where he says, when you are farming your field, when you are harvesting your field, don't harvest right to the edges. Leave a limit inside your limits. Create a boundary inside your boundary. Don't go over it a second time to pick up every last grape and every last bit of wheat. And why does Moses say this to them? Well, it's not just because maybe sometimes the farmers, the people with the landowners, the wealthy people, maybe actually they just need to stop when enough is enough. They don't need every last grape, frankly. But also, and I think this is really interesting, that it was so that other people, the just in case, I call it just in case, so just in case someone who is poor needed it, just in case somebody comes to the area who is in need in some way, just in case somebody who has less than the farmer does, is in need. And I really was, I was really challenged by that, because I thought, first of all, there is a point where enough is enough, and I don't need to actually harvest, even more of my time, even more of my energy. Like, I could leave some left over for me. But also, more importantly, perhaps, if I have time, if I have margin in my diary, in my finances, in my mental headspace, that means that when my neighbor speaks to me, like, I'm not like pretending I didn't see them because I just don't have time right now.
Right.
It means I can give some money to a good cause because, I've managed, and I know that's a big issue, and for a lot of people so it's no condemnation, but, if I have managed to work out my finances in such a way that I have some left over, then I can be generous. If my head isn't completely full, that means I can think about things or pray or meditate or talk with somebody. So I think there's a sense of leaving that margin at the end of the field and not gleaning every last bit. It's not just good for my well-being, which is something I think we talk a lot about quite rightly, but it also creates space and capacity and bandwidth for other people too.
Right, so others can glean. So that's the sort of the Old Testament term about, those who are not the landowners, that they can come along at the fringes of your field, and they can glean what you have left for them because you haven't gone to the very edges. And actually, it sets up a beautiful rom-com in the middle of the Bible called the Book of Ruth, in which a woman called Ruth gleans in a field of Boaz, and it ends up with King David, who ends up with the Messiah, the Lord Jesus. So that kind of idea of not going to the very edges and leaving a margin, it's actually quite large. It lives large in the biblical narrative. What it means today, does that mean my to-do list, Cathy, should be about 85% of what I planned for it to be? Like how granular are you going to get with how we apply this?
Well, I'll tell you how granular. I really can't talk to your to-do list because I've no idea, what your capacity is as a person. And we all have seasons, don't we? We all have deadline seasons. We all have time. I think if we are constantly living at the edge of our limits, we know physically we're not responding well. We start overreacting emotionally to other people. We know when we have no margin. I think everyone else knows, even if we don't. We really are. So I don't think it's necessarily, because your capacity actually might be different to mine, and I think that's important to know. But I think it is about saying, well, are there things I can do? And I'm pretty granular with myself. So, I'm just trying to leave a little gap between Zoom calls just to recalibrate a little bit. Or when I'm boiling the kettle, I'm just trying to stand still, look at the garden and breathe rather than scrolling through my phone or doing a bit of cleaning. Just what are there some things that I can do so that my pace isn't just, constantly warp speed. And so that I'm just creating some moments where I am, centering myself a bit, praying for a moment for somebody, looking after myself a little bit rather than already needing to be in the next place. So I'm not really present in the place that I'm already in. There are some things I can do. And if that means I do, a tiny bit less each day, but I'm more effective in all of those places, well, it might be that long term I actually achieve more. Who knows? But it might be that I don't keel over in the process, and I'm kinder to the people around me, which is also probably a very good thing.
Yeah. So as you talk about this, like on one level, it's very practical and pragmatic at the level of leaving space between Zoom calls. At another level, it gets really personal. It's because the reason why I pack things in between my two Zoom calls could be very different depending on different people and the way they're wired, So like for me, maybe it's I want to get on Twitter and make a popular tweet and get the likes and that sort of thing. But maybe someone else, they really want to nail down this. Maybe it's because they want to clean the house or something, and there might be more of a control thing or going on, or like because our hearts are craving different things. But just as you manage your time, you're not just managing your to-do list. You're managing your heart, aren't you? At a very deep level.
See, I'm really challenged when I read about the life of Jesus on this, because nothing that Jesus would have been distracted by was bad. Like, he's busy healing people. He's being kind to people that no one else is kind to. He's creating space for the people that no one else makes space for. Nothing. He was not watching Netflix. He was not, he was doing everything right. And yet Jesus had to work out what was his Father's business. That's the phrase he uses. He has to go and pray, spend some time on his own to work out what is the Father's business for me. Like, I don't want to do anything that's not the Father's business. And so I think I have to ask myself, in the season that I'm in, and those seasons do change. We've got young kids, or we're caring for elderly parents, or we've got deadlines. We've all got different pressures. It's not a guilt trip, but I think we all have to work out in the season that we're in, like, what is the Father's business for me? And is there other business that frankly is getting all my time and attention? Or, am I able to invest in the things that might matter to God? I remember reading a phrase from a book by an amazing Japanese theologian. I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, but it's Kosuke Koyama. And he talks about the fact that love has a speed. he talks about the 3 mile an hour God is what he talks about, and that Jesus was this walking speed God, and that love has a speed. It's not a technological speed. It's not internet speed. It's not the speed of a microwave. Love has a speed, and it's 3 miles an hour. It's walking with people. It's not constantly battling to get more done all the time. We can't constantly sustainably live like that. And if we want to love well, love ourselves, love others, and love God, then there's a pace that we have to find in that. And I think that's probably a challenge for most of us.
That phrase, I love the 3 mile an hour God, because it's reflecting again on a biblical theme that begins way back in Genesis. And way back in Genesis 5, I believe, is that the first time when Enoch walked with God and was not, because God took him. And it's this chapter of this guy died, this guy died, this guy died, this guy died. And then Enoch, like miraculously, supernaturally, who knows how this worked, but he managed to escape death. And then the only explanation that's given in Genesis 5 is, well, he walked with God. And it's like, it's actually this sort of answer to death somehow. It's like there is a kind of finitude that leads you to say, I'm going to suck the marrow out of life and extract every experience that I can. But there's a kind of finitude to life that makes you think, I want to slow down and know my maker and, smell the roses with him. And that is the true answer to death, rather than filling our lives with more and more. But that walking with God thing is huge, isn't it?
It is, and actually I think, it probably even predates Enoch. I think when you think of the story of Adam and Eve walking in the garden with God, until really they thought they knew better, and then they were just hiding from God. And I wonder just as you're speaking, I wonder if a lot of our running and a lot of our putting layers of stuff on stuff and filtering stuff and trying to achieve stuff is us just hiding. It's like we hide from God and, our mortality. We're hiding from vulnerability with other people. We're hiding from failure because we think if we make mistakes, that we're not good enough as people. And, we are just hiding. And actually, I think if we can come out from that and realize that if we walk in authenticity with other people, with ourselves, with God, that, without overstressing and overstretching and overwhelming ourselves, if we can move past all of this pretending front stage stuff and actually walk more authentically at a pace that is sustainable with people, that's where the richness lies. It's not how much money we have in the bank at the end of the day.
Yeah, and right there, we're getting right to the heart of what life is, really, and it's not hiding behind masks and performances, but we always want to perform in the face of judgment. And right back in the Garden of Eden, the whole lesson is don't perform in the face of judgment. Look bad in the presence of love. The best thing Adam and Eve could have done would have been to allow themselves to be found. And to be found in their nakedness, to be found in their lack. And then the Lord does that beautiful thing of clothing them. And that's just like a beautiful picture in the Bible. We always want to clothe ourselves with fig leaves. That's what Adam and Eve should try to do, which is like a picture of our ridiculous humanity trying to perform. Because fig leaves, I hope they had a really good moisturizer. This is not a good covering. And we're meant to think it's a ridiculous covering because the Lord has to go to great, lengths to cover us. And of course, in the New Testament, it talks about we are clothed in the Lord Jesus, and He was our great sacrifice who clothes us, and now we look good in the Father's eyes, not because of our busyness and not because of our performance. We haven't tried to perform in the eyes of judgment. We've tried to look bad in the presence of love, and that's kind of where the healing is found, isn't it?
Well, it is. And I think at the root of most of this is fear. The two primal human emotions, fear and love. And I think fear is at the root of so much of why we hide and why we perform. One of the chapters in Why Less Means More is less perfect and more progress. And I think this whole thing that we place on ourselves is performance anxiety that we create. Like, we have to have the perfect life and the perfect this and the perfect that. And actually, in a sense, we're hiding, and it's a fear that if we're not in control, if we can't manage everything, that somehow we've failed. But actually, I really believe that freedom is found when we understand that we are where we are, and that, it's perfectly normal to feel fear, but that love can triumph that. So if we can progress, if we can actually start where we are and make steps in the right direction, rather than constantly feeling that we haven't hit perfection and that we're constantly not performing hard enough and high enough and fast enough, if we can actually start where we are and give ourselves some grace and say, what is the Father's business for me today? Like, what is the best thing I can do today for somebody else, for myself? And it's not about like all hippie vibes. It really is about trying to live a fruitful and fulfilling life, but that one that is based in reality and love rather than unrealistic expectations and fear.
Tell me about Sabbath, because here's another massive kind of biblical theme. And for those sort of unfamiliar with the Bible invented the weekend, so you're welcome. It's kind of like this, it's not that the 21st century is the first always on culture or civilization. Actually, outside of sort of biblical norms, having holy days were sprinkled throughout the calendars in all sorts of different religions. But the idea that every 7 days, every member of the household gets a day off, even your animals, right, get this day, and there's a rhythm to the week. 6 days you labor, on the 7th day you rest, and there is a margin built in to the week. And it's often pointed out that we have 365 days in a year because that's the orbit of the Earth around the sun. And we have a day because that's the turning of the Earth on its axis. We have a month because that's the moon going around the Earth. Why do we have 7 days? Like, what's going on there? And it's this gracious gift of 6 days shall you labor, and on the 7th day there is rest. Tell me about the wisdom of Sabbath and how it might practically work itself out for us today.
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's margin in the week. And you're also right that we're not the first culture to be always on. If you live in an agricultural society, animals still give birth, and, crops need to be dealt with. And so actually this deliberate time to kind of rest and recuperate that obviously God built in right from in Genesis as on the day that he rested. So we're modeling ourselves on a God who, probably doesn't need rest, but chose to. But I think one of the things that I wrote less random and more rhythm, because I think our life is basically a collection of habits and rhythms, the choices that we make each day, probably completely subconsciously, how we put our socks on, the order we do things in the morning. We are just a collection of habits and routines and rhythms, and some of those work for us, and some of them, like eating cakes every day, work against us. But Sabbath isn't just about resting. It's actually, biblically speaking, it's about delighting. It's about celebrating as well. So it's not just, stopping. It's actually doing things that really fill your soul with joy and that enable you to celebrate the bigger picture of, God and your relationships and yourself. It's really kind of delighting in the world around you. And I think that's really important, because sometimes we create more work to do on our day off than we do the rest of the week. My to-do list for my day off can frankly sometimes, cause me to go into meltdown. It's not supposed to be always like that. Again, sometimes that's necessary. But if we are always skipping the moment where we delight, where we slow down and eat food with people we love, where we enjoy God's creation, where we listen to music, where we do the things that when our tank is depleting all week, if we miss the opportunity to fill that tank back up, not only by resting, but by delighting and celebrating, then at some point, that tank is going to keep bumping along the bottom of our resources. I think it's an incredible principle. And even if it's a digital Sabbath where we just remove ourselves, from always being on, and the complete lack of boundaries between work, home, on and off, even if we can just do things to create some kind of margin, mentally, emotionally, and physically, that's going to be a really good thing for us. There's this really, really cool thing that I read about recently called the Diderot effect. I don't know whether you've ever heard of it, but it's this French philosopher called Denis Diderot, and he wrote this amazing paper, like in the 18th century, called Regrets on Parting with My Old Dressing Gown. And so this guy was given this fancy new velvet gown, and what happened as a response was, to start with, he loved it, but in the end he hated it, because he ended up having to buy loads of new stuff to match the new beautiful thing that he had, because everything else looked a bit tatty in comparison. So he starts off with this nice new gown and he has to get some better clothes, but then he looks at his furniture and thinks, well, that's looking a bit shabby too. So he updates his furniture, and eventually, this spiral happens, right, where he gets out of control. And all kinds of economists and different people talk about the Diderot effect, of this spiral of accumulation that happens because it suddenly kind of creates this chain reaction of needing, when you've painted one room and you go into the hallway and you realize that everything else actually now needs doing. Right. It's that sort of thing. Or you buy a new jumper and you realize that your jeans are kind of like worn through. It's that thing where there's a chain reaction that can end up spiraling out of control, where people actually end up spending or gaining or focusing on the next thing, the more, beyond actually what is needed or probably sustainable.
So what is the way out of the Diderot effect? Because, I mean, one thing that's springing to mind is, didn't Jesus say something like, if you try to gain your life, you'll lose it, but if you lose your life, you'll gain it? There's how do you stop the upscaling, the infinite upscaling?
Well, there's another brilliant parable that Jesus told. He was so full of great analogies and metaphors about this guy who just constantly was getting more. So he had to buy a bigger barn because he got so much more. And then he had to build a bigger barn. And then he kept building his barns until he dies. And then, God kind of challenges him and sort of says to him, well, what were you doing with your life? And why were you not rich towards God and other people when you were just accumulating? And certainly, the people who use the Diderot effect to look at sustainable ecology and, environmental issues would say that, we have to step back from this rampant consumption that is killing our planet and ourselves. And we do have to look at, when is enough, and is what we're doing sustainable? This everything from fast fashion to our food and everything. I don't think this is new to everyone, but I think it's profoundly spiritual as well as practical. I think, we have a responsibility to care for this planet and to understand that, this is a very modern Western mindset, this more, new clothes every season. Like, we don't have to live that way. Not everyone in the world lives that way. And actually, we have probably more than we need. So we don't necessarily need to keep upscaling everything to match the newest thing. We don't need an upgrade of a phone every year,
Yeah.
It's possible to step back from the brink.
Yeah. And Jesus diagnoses that rich fool's kind of problem in Luke chapter 12 as he had earthly riches, but he was not rich towards God. And it's that vertical dimension that I think we're going to need if we're going to solve something as huge as, the consumption that is kind of wreaking havoc on our world. We need to have that vertical dimension. There needs to be a spiritual aspect. We need to be rich towards God. We need to have that sense of, I'm okay with the one who really counts, therefore I don't need all the stuff. And it seems to me like something like spiritual revival is required if we're going to reorder our lives in the ways that you're suggesting.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And for me, it is about freedom as well. And I think a lot of these old-fashioned spiritual principles, are really about finding freedom. We think these things will give us freedom, but actually sometimes it is the opposite of what we think that will give us freedom. Diderot said in that essay, he said, I was a master of my old dressing gown, but I was a slave to my new one. Oh. And I think that is so interesting, because actually we think that freedom is found in the more, but actually he was more satisfied and content. And I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that poverty or lack is where we find freedom. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that the answer to everything in life is not necessarily more. And we do need that vertical dimension, gives a perspective, maybe a bird's eye picture. We're able to look a little bit more kind of holistically at our lives, at the planet, at some of the issues that we face, and actually think there are small things that I can do in my neck of the woods that would make a really big difference.
Yeah. It reminds me of like the Apostle Paul in the book of Philippians. He says, I've learnt the secret of contentment in any and all circumstances, whether in plenty or in need, which is interesting because, whether in plenty or in need, we can take our eyes off what's really important in life. And he's like, I've learnt the secret of contentment in either of those circumstances. So it's not about being poor and it's not about being rich, but it's about having that perspective. That's very helpful.
And that's the difference, I think, between happiness and contentment. So I think we're absolutely obsessed with happiness, and there's nothing wrong with being happy. But happiness can be very fleeting and circumstantial. But contentment or joy are deeper things, and they're not just circumstantial. So I can be, content that I have what really matters most in my life, even if all of the external things, as we went through, have been stripped away. The things that actually so often we hang our identity on and we hang our sense of self on. Even if those things don't go to plan, even if plan A kind of goes really AWOL, we can still know a sense of contentment and peace, even if it's not easy, if we get beneath just happiness.
What do you think lockdown did for us? In many ways, my take on it is that it sort of accelerated a lot of the patterns that were already present in the world. But that whole idea of everything washing into everything else, in my world, kind of happened because I guess because I'm an extremely online person, and as a ministry, we went into an extremely online kind of mode. In another sense, obviously, lockdown happens and we are forced to stop. What are your reflections on how lockdown made us think differently about rhythms and randomness?
I honestly think that the lockdown is going to be something that we are going, sociologists and anthropologists and theologians and everyone is going to be studying for decades and decades to come. I think it's been a seismic shift culturally. It's been a seismic shift for parents, for young people particularly. And I think obviously for many people, it was just a season of loss and loneliness. So I think that's really important to acknowledge. But I think you are absolutely right in that I think when you look at work patterns and how they've changed since, I think when you look at people's expectations about relationships online and in person, that has absolutely, 100% shifted, and that's not going back to any way of how it was before. I also think for some people, I know some people were working harder than ever in lockdown, but for some people that hour's walk in nature, or, just taking those moments and actually really, really savoring those moments and savoring a little bit of social interaction slightly brought into focus just how precious those things are. And I think some of us are kind of mourning a little bit about the fact that seems to have dissipated as the busyness has ramped up again. So I think there are things that we gained in that period because for some people the work-life balance is more manageable, and there are clearly some huge losses from that period as well. So, some things a lot less of, some things more of. Again, it's worth thinking about what's working for us and what's not.
Yeah. We have talked about some very deep things when you might think that this kind of topic will just lend us to discuss our to-do lists and time management. But we are talking about walking with God. We are talking about our life being a mist. We're talking about our finite lives, and therefore we're talking about our mortality. We're thinking about our self-justifying nature. We're thinking about stopping and Sabbath and delighting first in God and in His world. So you can't have this conversation without touching on some deeply spiritual things. You've had your story and you've had this book, and you're able to interact with people who are not Christians, and yet everybody is wrestling with the exact same thing. Has your thinking around this book really helped inform those conversations? Have you been able to have rich conversations that touch on the things of Jesus while you have these conversations about less means more?
Absolutely. I think it's so interesting. There are so many programs on the television right now about decluttering and removing stuff from your house. And when I wrote Why Less Means More, I think most people think, oh, it's about getting rid of your Tupperware, And actually, in a sense, there is something about being less consumer, more curator. That is one of the things that I look at in there. But I just think that is a symptom or a gateway into exactly what you've described now, which is the bigger questions about just the fact that our souls and our minds feel cluttered, that we feel like we have accumulated a lot, but we're not good at relinquishing. We're not good at letting go, that we, feel like we're carrying a lot and we're not quite sure how to sift through that and to find a way through, to find that clarity. And I think, the human condition is the same, whoever we are, whatever background, whether we have a lot, whether we have a little, whether we're in our 20s trying to climb the career ladder, whether we're just retiring and wondering what to do with the time and the resources and the energy we've got left, how to leave a great legacy. I think all of us want to think about, well, what do I want to make space for in my life? What do I need less of? What do I need more of? And what matters most, actually, because we get one life and it goes so fast, it goes so fast. And there's a sense in which I think a lot of us, especially post-pandemic, are asking, well, those big questions. So yeah, in a lot of the interviews that I've done in different newspapers and on radio interviews, there has been a sense of the very practical, but also the very spiritual. They're really big questions about how we spend our life.
Tell me about some of those opportunities, because in some senses, books open doors to these sorts of platforms. So you've been able to speak in these contexts.
Yeah, I've been really, really fortunate. And it's so interesting. I've written a few books and I speak in all kinds of different places. But this seems to be something that is really connecting with people in a way that I hadn't expected. And frankly, I hadn't made the margin and time for. So that was a mistake, wasn't it? Suddenly it's like, well, can you write 800 words for this newspaper, or can you make time for this radio interview? And I'm like, oh gosh, I now actually have to work out how to make this happen. Whoops. But it's wonderful to be able to kind of go into those spaces and actually speak into people's homes, people's lives. And actually, I think hopefully in a non-judgmental way, say, I get it. Like, I've wrestled with this stuff too, but maybe there's an opportunity for us to kind of reflect on how we're spending our lives. We can waste our time, we can spend our time, but we can't duplicate our time. We can't get it back. Mm-hmm. So, what are you going to do with the resources and the energy and the money and the time that you have? Because it is finite, and it's a great opportunity, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you're making the best of this opportunity. I think it's really exciting, and something that many more Christians should be thinking about as a topic to really press into if we want to speak into the culture. This is top of mind for so many people today, and I think there are such riches in the Bible, and connecting those to the needs of the hour is exactly what needs to happen right now. So, Cathy, you've written this book. What is your great hope for it?
Well, I think my great hope is that it will connect with people, because we do live in an era where emotional well-being is, a real challenge for a lot of people. Mental health issues are, really, really prevalent. And actually, we are just living in a society where a huge percentage of people say that they are approaching burnout, that they are, really stressed and struggling. And so, I can't provide answers to all of those issues, and I certainly haven't got a silver bullet to offer. But I do have a sense of, you're not alone in this, and maybe there are some things that you could do with less of, and some things you could do more of. And here's my experience. You're not alone. And that's I always call myself a chief cheerleader and encourager. That's my job description. And if I can encourage people and cheer them on and help them to kind of make positive steps forward, that's always the feedback that I love the most. That people say, you just really encouraged me. You helped me to make some differences and some changes in my life. So that's my prayer, really.
Yeah, and it fits in with, progress and not perfection, and one step forward, walking at 3 miles an hour. Yeah, great. Well, Cathy, if people want to catch up with you and the work that you do, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, you can always go along to my website, which is cathymadavan.com, and that's got all my social links on there as well. I don't do quite as much social media as you, Glenn, but I'm out and about on social media, and I love connecting with people. I'm often speaking at different conferences and festivals, so they can keep up to date with me online, and hopefully I'll see people in person too.
Wonderful. Well, Cathy, we know that time is finite, but we're very glad that you've expended it here at Speak Life. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.